cities.
10-minute cities back in Australia after a brief Portland hiatus.
I know, and it's now April.
It is April. It was I think it's taken me the better part of a month to actually digest half of what I heard and learned and try to put some of it in writing for future use.
Well, on the theme of drinking out of a fire hose, we've just had our Urban Mobility Task Force Expressions of Interest close last week, and I got to sift through 50 applications, which I think is a little bit of an indicator that urban mobility is a hot topic.
I think everyone's finally figured out that to get the mobility right, then the cities will look after themselves. But it's also a space in change. Like I think the old business as usual is not going to work anymore. I saw something the other day around mobility which was said, if you can imagine Facebook and Google selling you ads from websites you used to browse 10 years ago is pretty much how we've been doing transport based on how we used to move around for the last 10 years, but that's the solutions we're doing. So it is time for a disruption in this sector for sure.
Yeah. I was speaking at Brisbane Property Leaders event last Thursday, I think it was, Wednesday, on the Autotropolis.
Yeah.
We had PwC presenting some interesting modelling around what happens with shifts in transit with autonomous vehicles. Peter Edwards, of course, always provocative, talking about designing cities in a way that's considered and thoughtful, and in particular in Brisbane's context, a real shift that is needed, particularly coming out of the last decade of a lot of heavy infrastructure investment in particular car infrastructure.
And it's timely, I guess in the last week, in Infrastructure Australia has said that they will prioritise the Brisbane's, metro / rubber wheel buses over the top of.
It's a metro, right?
Yeah, it's a metro with tyres.
Is it? Or isn't it?
Well, I don't know. It depends on which side of politics you're on, I guess. But prioritising that over the top of a major subterranean metro by another name type infrastructure, which I think is really interesting and telling. Maybe not in a good way as well of the future of mobility in the city, but we'll wait and see where that ends up.
So just on the Infrastructure Australia stuff, the other announcement I've just thought of that came out was IA are funding, I think it's the business case phase for the Clara project, which is the eight new smart cities connected by high-speed rail. So
between Sydney and Melbourne.
Between Sydney and Melbourne, and of course, really hot topic during the last 3 to 4 weeks is the overpopulation. Are we full? The Four Corners episode, decentralisation.
Yeah. Look at it. I guess a lot of room to grow in that, and I think decentralisation kind of makes sense maybe, but I'd also argue that if our rationale is that our cities are overgrown or full, then we probably should have a good look at ourselves around relative densities around the rest of the world. I think our cities are struggling because of where we're stuck in the middle of a suburban city hybrid as opposed to just getting full into it and just go, we're going to do a proper city like many European and our American friends who just density. When you've got density in people, everything else works, isn't it? Your mobility works because you've got heads of people. You can have day and night life and shopping and retail and services, and you just need more people. There is an awkward transition in the middle though.
Yeah. Okay. So jury's still out on this idea of overpopulation, decentralisation. Well, okay. Let me ask you the question. A question that's often asked: Do we need a population policy or strategy?
I reckon there's definitely a role for the federal government to play in helping to prioritise and shift money around the country based on population and or settlement strategies. We used to have the Australian cities team within a federal government department. I think it made a lot of sense, and there's a lot of good things that happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whenever that was. But I think there's certainly room for federal government to play, but probably more in a high-level stimulus to how they use our taxes we pay to shift it around. more fine-tuned than our kind of current GST distribution techniques. But yeah, for sure.
So, kind of related to that, the other thing since we last posted, the Western Sydney City deal. You know, I think it's, what is it, 8 councils?
Yeah.
All singing Kumbaya with the state government of New South Wales and the federal government to sort of align interests in infrastructure investment and things like that.
I guess it helps having a new airport to kind of be a catalyst and leverage off. But I look forward to more city deals. I think they're a good way to bring people into alignment. You know, money's always a good motivator to bring people into alignment. I guess it's early days, very early days there. Launceston's a bit further along. We're still waiting for our city deal to appear here in southeast Queensland.
You think it's going to come?
I think it has to come, doesn't it? You know, I mean, we're certainly growing at a rate of knots. It was interesting in, I guess, the last couple of weeks I was at the National UDIA Congress down in Melbourne, and they presented their annual State of the Land report, which is a pretty involved piece of assessment of both the land and now for the first time ever they've done the unit market. And a range of different things come out of that, and I won't get into that. But the key thing was, I guess, where we're sitting today, southeast Queensland was unilaterally identified by 3 different firms participating in that as being the most balanced and healthy market in the entire country in terms of, there's some anomalies in terms of some of our units, but broadly the key message was southeast Queensland is where they would put their money if they were developing either houses or apartments. The fundamentals are right. So our market's going to continue to run here, and I think a deal here to make sure that's sustainable makes sense.
So let's talk digital for a moment. Of course, the other thing that's happening right now as we're speaking is the Commonwealth Games. Telstra have opened up a little showcase centre down at Southport around 5G. Now, from what I read, I think what I'm reading from the marketing is it's the first kind of operational live public test of 5G in the world, and they've I'm not going to get this right, but a number of the Telstra Wi-Fi hotspots in public spaces have been sort of souped up to 5G. Now, 5G takes us to a place where the infrastructure needed is a lot more granular, a lot more kind of in the public space, the public realm, where you're going to see a lot more of it as opposed to sort of big towers scattered across the landscape. I think we're in for a very interesting period of dialogue, of debate around retrofitting our public spaces, places, streets and cities to equip ourselves for 5G.
Yeah, I think the 5G is really interesting on a range of different fronts because it's going to do a few different jobs. One, it's going to just give us more bandwidth as users to surf and do all of our digital stuff that we rely on. All these new apps and platforms which are going to be feeding us stuff. We need more bandwidth, but then it'll feed our IoT when we really get around to the Internet of Things embedded in our streets, giving us weather and air quality and moisture and all this stuff, and safety and security and cameras. And then in the longer term, probably run our autonomous vehicle fleets when inevitably they turn up on our streets, and certainly that's a core driver for it in the longer term. But in the short term, I think from talking with a few telcos, it's just purely about bandwidth. We're getting really greedy, we're using too much of it, and we also have much higher expectations of service standards and speeds now, so they're doing a lot of infilling. But it's all good, I think there's certainly a way to go, some thinking to be done on how this stuff sits in our streets and our public spaces, because there could be a risk of technification of our public realms without a lot of thought put to the aesthetics, but time will tell how that plays out. So,
minute to go, what's been the most interesting thing coming through on your LinkedIn feed recently?
Oh, look, a few different things. I mean, I think like a lot of people, have been following with interest the Uber incident from the States, where obviously, unfortunately, someone was killed in an autonomous Uber trial. Beyond that incident, which is sad, just watching all of the flow-on discussions in a range of different areas has been fascinating. And from dystopian stuff to, some thoughts that people on bikes now need to basically be given a sensor to wear so cars know where they are, which is just ridiculous and horrifying, through to, some really structured people going, well, we've had one incident, but we probably lose thousands of people every day through, you know, non-autonomous vehicles. So all in all, we're doing pretty good odds. And rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, let's just focus on how we can do more trials rather than trying to wind them up. Because I think there is a knee-jerk reaction for what we don't know to wind some of these trials up, which would be pretty sad.
Yeah, I suppose in the same vein, I found myself geeking out on a very long Twitter thread of a bunch of urbanists really unpacking that Uber pedestrian death incident, really interrogating and doing a post-mortem on the urban design of that intersection. What came not long after that was the American Planning Association releasing a pretty comprehensive guide around autonomous vehicles and city planning. And so I'd certainly recommend that sort of our friends listening in head over to the American Planning Association website. There's a ton of resources
and it's
there.
a really good report for planners. Even if you're just trying to dip your toe in, or where do I start with this stuff? It's at the right level. You don't need to be an AV expert to understand, but it's a good place to start getting your head around where we need to start thinking about cities as planners to deal with AVs. So
Absolutely.
righto.
Okay, till next episode.
See you all.
Yeah.